Fantastic first name, Matt Warner. How you doing today, sir?
I am doing well. Hello, fellow Matt.
It's great to see you. It's great to see you. Well, Matt, I'm just going to hand the stage right over and just let you get right into it. By the way, feel free to take like 3 minutes or so over. We can cut into our break after this. That's not an issue whatsoever. We know we want to hear what you've got to say, what you've got lined up for us today. Matt, you're the CTO over at Blumira, and today we're going to be talking about choosing the right XDR strategy. The stage is yours, sir. Take it away.
We are indeed. Thank you very much, Matt. And it was I'm excited to follow the cool stuff coming out of VMware. Although I don't think I was demo as cool as them, but we'll talk about a bunch of really great stuff. And I'm looking forward to seeing what kind of questions everyone has. So we're primarily going to be talking about XDR strategies today, specifically around what kind of XDR technologies are out there, how people are leveraging them, and just generally speaking, kind of where we came from to where we're going inside of the XDR market. And in general, I kind of like to start at where we kind of started with XDR. XDR started in 2018, really driven off of Palo Alto. When they were, I think a lot of us who were watching the market around that time kind of watched Palo Alto decide, hey, you know what? We have Panorama, we have Traps, we have all this stuff. Let's jam it all together into one thing. And it was a really good way of bringing that data together into one view. But we have this inherent kind of limiting nature that's continued to happen in the XDR market that really means that it has stayed up market. It hasn't really come down into the SMB and mid-market in a way that's really useful for people. So while we like XDR and Blumira sells XDR, and we'll talk about this more as we move forward, what I think is kind of most important to think about as we talk about all of this today is what are these products being built for? What are they being leveraged for? And who is going to be running and executing these solutions? Because realistically, we're only all as secure as the technology we leverage and how we're leveraging that technology. There's a few different reasons for that, of course, right? Like nothing is easy in security. I wish everything was easy in security. I think we all do, but nothing in IT and security is necessarily easy. And as we continue to see the increase of ransomware, and we continue to see breaches just broadly increase across SMBs, mid-market, of course, all the way up into enterprise. In the grand scheme of it all, it kind of seems like the technology that each and all of us are using is maybe in some cases not necessarily getting us what we want. And in the grand scheme of it all, there are a number of challenges associated with that, especially as you move further down into those, sub 1,000 people organizations. But even in larger organizations, you see these similar issues, although they may be somewhat kind of changed in how they're applied. So we see, and just broadly, of course, no one has enough time. There's never enough time to manage your rules, to look for bad stuff, to figure out how to get that data parsed, to figure out how you're going to evaluate things, to make sure you're getting the GRC data in place, to make sure you can meet compliance needs. All of it takes so much time that in the grand scheme of it all, having XDR versus having a SIEM versus just having anything puts most organizations in a situation where it's hard to know when you're being successful with that technology, which is kind of where I like to look at, like, how do you know you're being successful with your XDR, your SIEM, your EDR, your technology that you're leveraging? And in a lot of cases, there is no 24/7 team. Like if you're a bigger organization, you might have people on call. You may have a 24/7 team that's there on third shift. But if you're a smaller organization, you probably have 1 or 2 people that have been on call for 10 years, and they're kind of just hoping to get it done when they can get through it. So when we see people moving deeper into XDR, there's this inherent kind of drive of, well, XDR clearly is going to give us what SOAR was promising to have. So hopefully this will all work for what we want. And I think what we've all kind of realized across the industry is that the panacea is really hard to have just appear to us all. And as we go through this, I think the biggest identifying factor is really more of a, how can we best make sure that our team can respond quickly, have automated response where relevant, and really most importantly, continue to reduce risk. Because in the grand scheme of it all, ideally, you don't have to get up 24/7. Ideally, you've reduced that risk so much that your threat coverage can be reduced as well. And of course, how hard is that thing to use? In a lot of cases, technology for security is not straightforward to use. It's not easy to use. You need a lot of training. You need to integrate a bunch of different pieces together. And unless you have a large team, that's really hard to do. And even if you do have a large team, aren't there better things for everyone to be doing than frantically trying to make software work for them in the grand scheme of it all? So today we're going to talk about, that was more setting everything up. And today we're going to talk about three main pieces of the agenda as it relates to XDR and EDR. SIEM-driven XDR, I'm going to give you my opinion on this and where the industry is going as it pertains to kind of what SIEM was, what XDR is now, and how those two are coming together. Alternate approaches we're seeing in the market, what I'm sure a lot of you are using in the market and how that's working for people and what else might be out there available for you. And of course, an analysis against all of them. We see a lot of technology. You all see a lot of technology. We all have somewhat different needs, but we're all using very similar data. So how do we really best solve those problems broadly for all of us and make it so we can, sleep at night and not answer a page at 2 a.m., which is really, I think, the goal of all of us, right? So we'll start with a SIEM-driven XDR, which I admit is biased because that's primarily what Blumira does. And that is because Blumira started kind of with the base of SIEM is always going to be important. By its nature, in our industry, there is a need to have data coming out of platforms and evaluate that data. And over the years, we've, of course, seen that grown into the need of how are we going to do threat detection? How are we going to do correlation? How do we best bring that data in the areas that we know there will be threats? And that's a lot of where XDR was driven from of, well, SIEM is fine, but it's really hard to deal with. Let's focus on the endpoint and then correlate that information in, which is not a bad idea by any stretch of the imagination, but that other data needs to be considered a first-class citizen. Looking at endpoint data is great, but firewall data, data from your cloud environments, those are all just as important when it comes to how those breaches are starting and how risks just generally hit your environment. And in general, when you don't treat the importance of compliance requirements or GRC need with security, it can also just generally make things a little more complex for that organization when you're segmenting that data need between, well, I have security to detect and I have compliance work to do. The further you go down into that middle market and smaller companies, it gets a lot harder to segment those two technologies out and say, well, that's the GRC team's just effort to deal with. We'll deal with the security side. And in general, I am a strong believer in breaking that kind of focus or focal point on the endpoint, just generally speaking, and allow for that broader defensive model. I'll talk about this a little further into the presentation, but generally speaking, what we see is if you look at a broader source of data, not only from firewalls, but also just from the endpoint outside of EDR telemetry, you can get even deeper into that detection stack without having to do a lot of complex, unnecessary work for yourself. And of course, it enables to detect those threats and risks that aren't part of that stack. It's in a perfect world, we would always identify those threats that are associated with the NGAV or the EDR stack. But in some cases, some threats never go there. If someone turns on a forwarding rule in Microsoft 365, that's something that you need to detect alternatively outside of that stack. And in general, there's a number of advantages that we look at from the standpoint of combining that concept of SIEM and XDR. And it's primarily around getting real value from your data and combining kind of the real benefits of XDR into it, which is to say, if you're able to collect all the data that's important to you, you're able to do that in a way that you don't need to worry about the scale associated with it. And you're able to do that also in a way where you have correlation across those different types to get more benefit out detections. You only have a situation that makes life easier for you and makes it so you can continue to engage with that technology in a way that really works for your organization and doesn't work for the technology that's underlying it. Because generally, as we all know, I think in a perfect world, we would all have similar value and data for each organization, but all of us have our own needs inside of that data. And having a SIEM plus XDR available to you to say, I have a SIEM that I need to pull data out and I need to evaluate this data, but I know I also want to look at the data from an endpoint perspective while also being able to correlate against my firewall logs. Those are all highly valuable needs within an organization. And the ability to do both is more important than the ability to happen to be able to detect one thing because of that XDR that was very focused on the EDR side. And in general, I think SIEM is looked at as kind of a classic enterprise, large environment effort. And what we see here at Blumira is that if you take those previous learnings of enterprise kind of applicability in SIEM and you apply it to SIEM plus XDR, you just get more benefits for everyone. And of course, if you're going to move into the world of XDR, you're going to move into the world of making life easier, you have to have integrated workflows. You need to make the analysis easy for the user. So as we think about what siem+xdr is, which is really more focused on data as a first-class citizen, making sure there are detections broadly across those different types of data, while also ensuring the XDR endpoint focus is there, we move into the alternate approaches associated with XDR, which, again, like, there are no bad choices here. Even though I'm the founder and CTO of Blumira, generally speaking, we all have our own needs within organizations, and those needs all get applied in different ways depending on what you need to do for yourselves. So it's not a decision where we're saying, well, I want to do that or I want to do this. Many solutions combine multiple approaches, like SIEM and XDR, like an EDR focused SIEM, one that's primarily cloud native. We'll talk about a few different types across the next few slides here. And in general, that best option for you is really going to balance on what are your organizational needs, what are your priorities, and what does that environment look like? Are you a full Mac shop? If you are, there might be a different direction you want to go in when it comes to pulling that data out, evaluating that data, and figuring out what the risk is for your environment. But I think the most important thing for all of us in the industry is that there's just still no, and I don't expect there ever will be, a silver bullet that solves the problem for us. I think a lot of us who've been in the industry for 10, 15, 20 years look across it and say, well, it'd be awesome if it would just say what we want. But the nature of evolution, the nature of how attacks change, how TTPs change, how attackers just change. If you think back to 2016 when WannaCry was kicking off and Eternal Blue leaked, to now, it feels like it's been 30 years, but realistically, it hasn't been that long. And it's allowed this massive evolution in how ransomware and just the kind of capitalism of ransomware has grown behind it as well. So there's this deeper need for better detection. There's a deeper need for better data, but it's also happening at the same time as this evolution of change is happening inside of XDR, inside of SIEM, inside of defensive security as a whole. So in general, it's kind of more of a, going back to what are your needs? Does the solution give you the detections you need out of the box, or do you need to build them yourselves? How much tuning do you need to do? And if you need to do a lot of it, do you have people available to do it? And can it get to the scale you need? And now, don't think about the scale right now. Think about the scale 1, 2, 3 years from now, because no one wants to switch their XDR SIEM technology year to year. That just sounds very painful and tiring for everyone. So first, let's talk about more of a cloud native XDR. These are going to be XDRs that are generally less closed, which is to say they're not vendor focused. And I'll talk about that in a second as well. And they're going to be more focused on providing that data, the ability to scale at the cloud level, leveraging their technology. Always a good way to scale out where needed, but there can also be cost expectations associated with that. Microsoft Sentinel XDR is a really good tool. But if you want to scale out those analysis logs, it ends up being really expensive over time. And what we've seen over that time period is that if you aren't aware as to what your volume will be, or you aren't really sure what it will become, those costs can increase significantly over time. And even if there is an easy deployment inside of those Microsoft 365 existing kind of embedded solutions, you run into a situation where the moment you want to add in your Palo Alto firewall that's going to fire out, 50 gigs of data a day, you're going to realize significant costs associated with it, while also trying to figure out how to generate value from it. So while cloud native XDRs can be really great for scaling, for making that response easier, for making deployment easier, depending on where you're deploying it to or pulling data from, it can make it a little harder for identifying what the cost expectations are and making sure that you know what your data will look like. There has been a bigger push lately on unlimited for cloud XDR or cloud EDR, which is great. And it's really more of a, how does that work for your organization? Going back to the previous slide, what does your organization need? Do you know where you're currently at? And what are kind of the goals of your defensive security program? And as we move forward across the industry of XDR, we of course know, it's where we started with closed XDR. We know, looking at Palo Alto, SentinelOne, CrowdStrike, they all have their own XDR solutions. Palo Alto, of course, being the first. FortiGate has their own fun situation with FortiSIEM as well. And in every situation where there's a closed XDR, you're guaranteed to get really good value and threat detection associated with that vendor's data. We know from a lot of conversations, I'm sure you all have experienced it as well, SentinelOne with their Singularity XDR product is great for SentinelOne XDR detection. It works really well for response, it works really well for detection, but the moment you move into other types of data, not only do you have to pay for that data to get loaded into that SIEM that's behind the XDR product in SentinelOne, but you also don't get value out of that data without building your own detections. So you run into this situation, which is just kind of inevitable in security, right, over the last 20 years or so, where there are certain pieces of it that work well for you, but there are other pieces that don't necessarily fit with your needs. And in those situations, it really is important to evaluate, okay, maybe we don't need to use a vendor lock-in XDR, or maybe we do because we're going all in on this technology and this is going to work well for us because we're a growing small to medium-sized enterprise. And it always, in most cases at the very least, requires some amount of setup and maintenance. There are some cases, of course, like CrowdStrike Complete, where you're going to get that support and they're going to help you make that work for you. But even in those situations, there's still that need for data, for visibility, for compliance. And in closed XDR situations or vendor XDR situations, it can be a lot harder to get the value out of that data without continuing to increase your total cost of ownership. Two more, don't worry, I'm not going to keep iterating on these. One of the other two that I want to talk about is EDR-based XDR and AI-based EDR. So they're XDR, and they're similar in their own kind of ways, generally speaking. And in the case of an EDR-based XDR, it's really focused on, and like we were just talking about with SentinelOne, for example, we're really focused on evolving from an NGAV into something more focused on TTP, like definition detection, with the goal of being, hey, we're going to use AI, we're going to use all of our known TTP stuff, and we're going to identify those threats generally. What we've seen in these situations is that they tend to be too loud. Without the tuning that's really focused on your organization or your vertical, or even just kind of how your company looks, which is to say SMBs for municipalities look different than Target. They're just different organizations. So you get a lot of power out of that EDR-based XDR. You get that deep endpoint focused. You get a lot of information out of it, but it can also at times, similar to AI, because of the data that's coming out or the data being leveraged, you get that myopic focus on the endpoint, the data coming out of the endpoint, the telemetry. And you can at times miss critical issues that are coming up because you're only looking at one view or a limited amount of views because of the cost associated with adding more data in. So it's really you do get those really awesome benefits of the critical capabilities of any sort of structure around where you're looking to go from detecting your endpoints, but it can make it difficult to do that broad threat hunting in the environment. And I will talk a little bit more about that as we move forward into the last section here. The last kind of other XDR I want to talk about is the AI-based XDR. So we're starting to see these grow a lot more, especially as GPT changed the world 8-10 months ago, or however long it was. It's hard to tell what time is anymore. And generally speaking, these are really interesting because I think a lot of us have a general kind of wish that the industry could have AI that just solved problems for us. And what we know from the last, 10, 15 years of AI, and there has been an improvement here, is that AI is really good at detecting anomalous situations, events inside of your data. And what we also know is those anomalous events don't necessarily mean anything. They could be a bad thing, but they may not. So you get into this tuning kind of cycle that happens with AI-based XDR, where you're making sure that data set works with the way that you are detecting stuff within that environment. And similar to the EDR, it reduces the amount of data you're pulling in because it's focused on a very specific set of data. This is changing, of course. AI-based XDR is evolving, and I expect that over the next year or so, you're going to see a lot of the AI and XDR and just generally in defensive security move away from using AI to do detection and instead moving AI into how to do kind of logic workflow evaluation of what to do next. There will, of course, always be some amount of evaluation, but generally speaking, I think the biggest kind of pattern across all those types that we just talked about is really that we're still focused on TTPs. We're still focused on kind of the good old days of detection. And realistically, the basic practices of IT haven't changed a lot over the last 15, 20 years. We know there's a bigger need for certain things like, okay, you're not going to segment, you can do zero trust, you can make these things easier for yourself by doing these different things inside of your technology stack. But the need to evaluate your data, the need to be able to pull in as much data as possible in a way that is useful for you, and to be able to meet your compliance requirements all kind of line up in a very specific way that make it so you as an organization can be successful without doing extra work. Because really that's the gist of it all. Doing extra work is not fun for any of us. So I'm going to talk a little about the different types of solutions and to an extent how Blumira fits into it. And for Blumira, when we talk about Blumira and when we think about Blumira, at least for myself, we're in that kind of SIEM plus XDR space. We started as a SIEM, we grew into adding an XDR technology, and we believe that having both as a holistic solution solves that data problem as a first-class citizen, generally speaking. But for the most part, all of these technologies across the XDR kind of landscape have pros, and they all have their own cons as well. And what works best for you, what works best for your environment will really depend on each and every kind of available resource in your environment as well, which is to say most organizations, especially those organizations that don't have their own built-out SOCs and security teams, should not be worrying about ingestion, parsing, or correlation and collection. These things are really items within an environment that if you are a big enough environment that you have your own specific data, you have your own specific practices, and you have your own specific engineering teams, you may not want something that's going to automatically do all this for you and make assumptions based off your data. And you may want to start looking to something that is going to be more structured around, well, I have a large enterprise. I want to build things in the way that I need it. However, it's worth also thinking about if that's necessary for the organization. In my experience, there tends to be a really deep focus on business need, which is not a bad thing because, of course, the economic buyer is the person buying the thing. But the business need and the security needs are not necessarily always aligned. And it can be often a situation where they get conflated, where it's well, we really need that thing. And it's worth thinking about, well, what will work best for your organization? And if you had more time in your day, which is to say, if you went with something that was like a cloud XDR that was more focused on making life easier for yourself, more automation, easier to leverage, makes things more straightforward for you, you have more time in the day to do other things. And I think all of us would love more time in the day to do other things because it's never a bad thing. And of course, that moves into that next stage of the XDR SIEM stack, which is to say, you're getting this data in, it's getting parsed, it's getting structured. Now what? How do we make sure detection works? In our experience, and I believe there's been a really deep pivot over the last number of years here for larger SIEMs, larger XDRs to do their own TTP detection to an extent, but also heavily leverage things like, well, there are open source detections, there are Sigma detections. It'll be great. Just use those. And in our experience, those are good if you have a team that can work and tune and make those detections work for your organization. But if you don't have that team, more than likely what it's going to do is create a lot of noise, put you in a situation where you aren't able to complete those detections or those kind of work through that workload associated with it. And it'll just generally make it a lot harder for you and your organization to be successful just because of the nature of the complexity of it. It's just kind of how it goes at that point. So thinking about what you need for your environment, and while as a security person, I love threat hunting, but as a CTO Blumira, as someone who's run security programs, as someone who's been an operator, I know that there aren't enough good threat hunters in the world for every organization. So having a way to leverage that technology to make you better at defensive security, to be better kind of inherent threat hunters, is just as important in the grand scheme of it all. Just as much as being able to respond to that thing, know why it happened, and be able to solve the problem. Because realistically, there are never going to be enough of us. Being able to push these solutions down further and let juniors, IT, solve those problems while you are working on the rest of the stuff is important. And of course, kind of going back to where we started on this whole thing, is it scalable? Does it fit within your overhead that you can bear within the organization? And is it easy to use? There was a big drive for a long time to make security technology continuously more complex, continuously show more data, make it so it's more enriched. And I suspect that there's been a large kind of too far of a pivot in that regard, because in a lot of cases, it's not really about the specific evaluation, especially if you have accurate detection. It's about the response. It's about if you can bring that data in and get the visibility and how fast that response can be for you. And that means that waiting for your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 may not be ideal. You may want it to automatically be isolated. You may just want it something that you can give to one of your junior employees and say, here is a workflow. This will scale for you. It will be easy to use. Don't worry about it. Because in general, it's going to reduce that total cost of ownership for you. And then you can use that money for other stuff, which is never a bad thing. And in general, kind of as you think about how you're moving into these kind of technologies, maybe you already have one, maybe you don't. What are your top gaps and challenges? Where are you running into that you need to solve those problems and you need to make it easier for yourself to solve those problems? Because, no one else is going to solve them. And it ends up being kind of all of us at each individual company from a security leadership perspective saying, all right, here are our gaps, here are our challenges. I believe this can help us solve the problem the most in this situation. And in general, security infrastructure changes. And that isn't to say that older technology can't do just as good as new technology, although assuming it's not end of life. But it is something that it's worth considering, continuing to think about how will this be bolstered by what I'm doing? How will this be improved by what I'm doing? If I have this older Linux machine, if I have an HPUX machine, can I get data out of that so I can at least know what's happening? So thinking about your entire environment and saying, where do I need to get better visibility to make sure my infrastructure is secure is just as important as thinking about, well, I'd like to see what's being detected on that one server. And of course, not only factor in the size and complexity of your environment, but factor in where you'll be in 3 years, 5 years. No one wants to change their SIEM or XDR every year. So make sure it's something that will work for you. It'll work for your diverse infrastructure and it'll work as your infrastructure changes. And of course, whatever works for your team, like your team is going to be the ones running the thing. So making sure that they can do it, making sure that they don't need vendor expertise to make the technology work for them is paramount, because it's the only way to secure your organization is to make sure that people can act on what's being sent to them. So I'm going to take a step back and talk a little around SIEM and XDR, we'll call it SIEM-driven XDR, and the benefits associated with it that go beyond a bit of that just EDR focused. And this is going to be primarily around how Blumira has approached some of these things. So in the case of Clop ransomware, they started attacking MoveIt. Blumira was able to detect it on day one, primarily because of Blumira's ability to collect those IS logs coming in through the environment. And that's associated with the fact of, and you see this across other cloud XDRs as well, where we're really focused on pulling in as much data as possible from each endpoint across all different things that create that data, which is to say, in this situation, Clop failed to actually execute the web shell, but they were able to land the web shell into the actual folder. So the ability to leverage those IS logs to see that there was a post that created that file and combine that with the EDR logs to say, hey, we see a file write being sourced from the IS process. That gives you that really tight correlation without needing to know ahead of time that MoveIt was going to attack Clop. And it's the very similar pattern that you see during any sort of proxy shell or exchange exploitation as well, or really anything that's leveraging IIS or similar web servers to do that kind of exploitation. And I bring it up primarily because think of that from the standpoint of correlation, of the ability to pull in multiple different types of logs and not just focusing on the EDR. Now, that's not to say an EDR couldn't have detected this by itself. The moment that web shell started doing, like calling to command or calling to PowerShell, that would have been an additional detection. But it's one of those areas where we want to move up detection as much as we can up that stack, and looking for known TTPs across different data types that are going to tell you these things is of paramount importance as threats change over time. Disk failures is one that I find very interesting. This is something that Blumira has done a lot over time, which is pull in data from your Windows host that most people don't generally pull in. And one of the areas that we really like is to pull in your kind of driver logs and logs coming out of all of your Windows machines. And what we found is the ability to do things like detecting disk failures because of smart driver output and other areas inside of those Windows logs, program installs, really anything that you could want can be generated out of that Windows environment. But what you have to do is scale out that window log collection. You have to really pull a large amount of that data out. And the way that I look at that is it's the responsibility of the cloud SIEM, of the SIEM plus XDR to do that, or cloud XDR, to do that work for you. But often what you'll see across these technologies is more of a deeper focus on EDR telemetry coming out of specific areas, rather than focusing on the data that's inherently available to them inside of these platforms. So in my experience, getting ahead of a server failing because of disk failure, potential disk failure alerts, it's an easy effort for organizations, and it makes it so you have IT buy-in just as much as you have security buy-in to that technology. That's a significant investment for your organization. And of course, APT detection. Talk about Clop ransomware. We talk about how this is going across the environment. It's always important to look for those TTPs that are going to be leveraged either by APTs or ransomware, because they're overlapping really at this point. And Blumira, for example, has done a great job of identifying things like the oil rig exploit by Iran and similar, because they're also leveraging TTPs that are known by ransomware operators, that are known broadly across the market. And it's always of paramount importance that we look across those TTPs and say, hey, this is what could happen. This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like across a variety of different data types. And here's how we can pull that together in a way that makes it the most straightforward for that organization. And generally, kind of combining these all together, if you're able to look across a large amount of data, if you're able to leverage that data in a way that's useful across not only risk, but also operational and proper threat detection, the value for your organization drastically increases, because you're able to do a lot more with that data, and you're just broadly able to be a lot more successful as an organization, because you're able to just generally get more, which is not a bad thing. And the last thing I'll note, of course, is Blumira we're a free SIEM. So on the SIEM side of the world, if you want to try out Microsoft 365, by all means, go crazy. We also have our XDR platform as well, of course, with some automated response and structure. And you can see those badges there. What I wanted to touch on real quick there was Blumira and other organizations like us, of course, but we'll talk about Blumira in this case, is really focused on making it easy to use and easy to implement, and something that actually makes you happy. And that's not something that we see a lot in the security market. We think it's of good importance that it's easy to implement data into that platform. It's straightforward for those people to use the platform. It's low friction for you to use it, broadly speaking. And those hard kind of sharp edges that are associated with a lot of XDR environments are really made to be easy for you to be successful in, and easy for you to just broadly be able to execute across the environment in. I wasn't sure if we were going to do Q&A in here. I got a QA, so I'll answer that here. So we got a question that essentially said, do you need a SIEM to use XDR? And the answer for that is very much no. You don't need a SIEM to do XDR. And in a lot of cases, what we're starting to see is kind of this continuous dilution, and dilution is kind of too strong of a word, but dilution from, well, you don't need a SIEM, you just need an XDR. And when that happens, you kind of get this dichotomy that occurs where you break apart how data is being handled inside of the security environment, which if you're a large organization, that can be a tolerable thing. But if you're not a large organization, that can get a lot harder for you. And it can often result in the need for multiple different sources or truths of data when you're shipping that data out. So it's not required by any stretch of the imagination. But I do believe that when you are not using a SIEM with XDR, or you're not using them close to each other, because it really depends on the technology, you often reduce the amount of visibility you could get inside of those environments. And when that occurs, it's just one of those areas where, getting value from your data is worth a lot. Your data is worth a lot to you. That metadata coming out of those environments is worth a lot. Knowing how people are opening files, knowing how people are using Microsoft 365, knowing what kind of driver issues you have in those machines, all have value from the standpoint of at least operational security in your environment. So the SIEM side does end up becoming much more important as you expand out kind of your, what is the responsibility of security? And in SMB and mid-market, the responsibility of security in IT is essentially everything. So in those situations, the SIEM becomes a lot more important. If you're a big enough company that you can segment those out, you have enough people that you can say, well, this is for the SIEM for data, and we're going to put this data into the XDR, and this is how we're going to evaluate it. That can work. However, I think it's worth going back to where we were, go back 7-10 years ago where SIEM was really kicking off, and think how security has really changed between then and now. And I don't think it really has appreciably changed. What's changed is some of the technologies behind it, the scale that we can get to now, and how can we really take what we learned then, take where we are now, apply them both in a way that makes us all more secure.
Awesome. Matt, thank you so much. You're right at time. No. I was letting you go with that final question. You're good to go. Don't worry about it. Totally good. Awesome. Well, Matt, thank you so much for being here.